is distribution, and let's see what happens next. Okay, and as you can see here, 60% of this, even more, is just in China, United States, and European Union. And in other emerging and developing economies, including India, and Africa is nowhere there, basically, this is very little. Okay, that's the problem number one, distribution of this investment. Second, concentration of minerals and supply chains. And be careful, minerals mining is a different story than refining and material production, and not to mention the energy technology production. And what you can clearly see here is that when it comes to mining, Africa has a big role to play. But immediately afterwards, in refining, this role is much less. And China, and we see a concentration in one country. I repeat, this one country. The focus is not because of China. The focus is because it's concentration in one country, which is not good for any indicator, including energy security. And this is true for refining, material production, and energy technologies like solar PV, wind, electric vehicles, and electrolyzers. So that's the issue number two. My issue is this. Sorry. Part of this can be solved, and should anyway be solved, by recycling. So recycling can massively reduce the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for materials, for water consumptions, and for energy use. And I wish to underline that not only the IEA has done a lot of analysis in this field, but it actually has proposed for the COP30 climate agenda a doubling of mineral recycling rates by 2035, minus 30% emission reduction for mining and refining of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission reductions, and driving for what we call a responsible diversification. But then once again, if you go up to the value chain and you look at manufacturing, this you can see very clearly that there are hundreds of factories in China, India, ASEAN, and the US and European Union, but Africa is basically absent. And that's the problem of stepping up the value chain. So I wish to just mention a few points of our recent report that we did for the G20 in South African presidency. And again, I start from what everyone understands, which is US dollars. The value of PV, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, electrolyzers, and heat pumps is rapidly approaching US dollar 1 trillion annually. However, Africa accounts for less than 1% of this value, despite the fact that you remember the graph with the blue bars, many minerals are coming from Africa. So Africa has vast energy resources. It has vast of all types, of fossil fuels, but also on renewables. Has critical minerals, but they, and as we know, has also a very high rate of lack of energy access. So many African countries, moreover, have the potential for low production costs. And this is what we also analyzed with a great detail. We have a sophisticated material model where we have a regional analysis of the costs of the products, accounting for everything, for energy prices, cost of labor, cost of capital, cost of material. So potentially, Africa would have costs that are interestingly similar to one of China, and definitely much better than the European Union. So this is definitely something to look at. And this is my slide, my last slide, which again, I want to focus on the trillions, well, the billions here, not trillions. We assess a very clear opportunity for critical mineral beneficiation in Africa, which could lead in 15 years time frame from 2024 to 2040 to an increase of the value by 3/4, by 75%. And I would like to finish this rushing presentation with this positive message and give the floor to Justin Garrett, which will, I'm sure, animate a moderated discussion. I have to apologize, I have to rush to another event. And Justin, the floor and the challenge is yours, because this is also very noisy.
So just invite everyone to come and take a seat. And Paolo, thank you so much for that very speedy but very comprehensive overview of supply needs for the transition. Cannot hear me at all? Okay, all right, I'm going to start screaming. Thanks, Paolo, for the very comprehensive overview of supply needs for the transition, the importance of diversification, and also some of the ways that government can try to support this. So I just wanted to make an additional point before we start with the panel, and that's that countries have been very active in having multilateral discussions on this issue. And I'd like to turn to the Ambassador of Canada to Brazil to start us off. So Canada's G7 presidency presented the Global Critical Minerals Action Plan and a roadmap for standard-based markets this year. So as ambassador to Brazil, how do you see the contribution of Brazil and Latin America and its resources of critical minerals to the global transition?
Thank you so much, Justine. Can you all hear me okay? And a big thank you to our Australian host today. I like to joke with my Australian colleagues that Australia is one of my top 5 favorite continents. So it's great to be here this afternoon. It's a great question. And let me just start with making a couple of points, and I'll be brief. I know you've got a lot of content to cover. So first of all, I think for Canada and our approach in the G7 context, we really kind of tried to focus our work to continue some of the work that's already begun within the G7 to ensure that we build and continue to build resilience of supply. I think as the chart by Paolo kind of noted, I mean, there was a lot of concentration of processing capacity in China in particular, but also in other markets around the world as well. And in the case of Brazil, a lot of their concentrate or even their raw ore gets exported for processing elsewhere. So I think that whole concept of building supply chain resilience requires companies to look a little bit more strategically at sort of vertical integration. And I think our Critical Minerals Action Plan in the G7 context is trying to ensure ways that within that G7 framework, but also working with developing countries and emerging markets to be able to drive the financing, be able to drive the technology to help in bringing some of that value-added processing into those jurisdictions as well. A robust supply chain is a diverse supply chain, and that diversity, I think, is really fundamental to our efforts. In addition, I would just say bilaterally for Canada and Brazil, we have a lot of investments in mining here in Brazil. We have a lot of activity, as do other countries, but I think particularly we have a strong presence in terms of gold production and critical mineral production. And the access to financing, the access to funding is fundamentally important. And the Brazilian government and its mining association have been working with us and with others to try to find ways to really build that sort of ability for Brazilian mining companies and others to access the funds, financing, access the resources they need to develop these projects, to go from exploration to get all the way to full production and hopefully to production and processing here in Brazil. So I think our general approach is inclusive, trying to find ways to build that connection and really reinforcing the concept of avoiding too much concentration. And in fact, SEBRI, which is one of Brazil's, I think, premier think tanks, did a recent review or analysis of the critical mineral sector, working with one of the key mining associations here. And one of the conclusions in that report was the vulnerabilities to the Brazilian economy, but globally, of too much concentration. And I think they're very aware of that issue and are committed to moving forward with it. Thank you, Justine.
Excellent. Look, thank you so much. So some important points there around the financing question, the inclusivity question, and also the role of industry. I'd like to now turn to the other side and to introduce Pedro Bracante, who's a special advisor to the COP30 president and also head of energy and mining at the Embassy of Brazil in Paris. So he's one of our colleagues in Paris. So Pedro, please tell us what has been Brazil's experience in creating local value and supply chains for Brazil's energy transition needs, and how that's also translated into your interactions internationally on this issue.
Thank you very much, Justine and colleagues. I'm very glad that spoke, that I'm speaking after Paulo's presentation and after Ambassador's words, because it matches perfectly our perspective from Brazil. So what we see is a huge opportunity in this slide here. We are almost doubling globally the investments and the production of critical minerals to power this new economy, this low carbon economy that is going to be the reality everywhere. But we want this picture to learn from past errors, from national policies and international cooperation. So what we need to achieve is a sustainable production of mining and processing of mining, and also minerals, sorry, but also do it in a cooperative way among countries. And of course, concentration is a big challenge, and we want this picture to evolve along the years. And Brazil is getting ready to be a major player in the diversification of critical mineral supply. But also, very importantly, as Ambassador of Canada mentioned, Brazil is looking to mining as an industrial policy opportunity with the right financing tools, with the right incentives, and of course in a framework of sustainable production through environmental licensing, social licensing as well. It will be very important to develop not only the exploration of mining reserves, but also the refining and the technological industrial plants that will process these minerals, that will create more diversity in the global supply. And maybe a final word on the internal development. It will also be very important for local communities and some of the least developed states in Brazil. As you are aware, Brazil is a large country with a lot of different realities, economic and social realities along the country. And mining can be, if produced in a sustainable way, it can be a major driver for economic development and social inclusion. So that's what we're looking forward with different national policies. The Ministry of Mines and Energy is not only leading a whole set of policies, but also created a national council on mining this year to make sure that we will move from that smaller box to this big box, and Brazil will play its part in a sustainable way, in an inclusive way. Thank you.
So thanks, Pedro, and a couple of themes coming out there that are a continuation really of the themes of Brazil's COP30 presidency around inclusiveness and other things. So that's fantastic. So I'd now like to introduce Gaia Poulston, who's the Assistant Secretary of International Partnerships at Australia's DQ. So Gaia, we've heard a little bit about the G7 and G20 efforts this year focused on building multilateral cooperation in this area. So building on these efforts, can you see any further practical steps that could be taken at multilateral level to mobilize private and public capital, and also to strengthen international partnerships under the COP agenda for this issue?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I think what we need to be looking at is a kind of network of domestic, bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral partnerships and efforts in order to move forward in this space. And that's kind of the way that we look at it in Australia. Kind of the NDC frames things for us. For those of you who are not aware, Australia has announced our NDC for 2035. 62 to 70% reduction in emissions on 2005 levels. And the reason that we've set this target in this way is to make it both achievable and ambitious, but more important, it's investable. And I think that's what we are trying to do in Australia, and this is what I think we are hearing that markets want from at the multilateral level as well, is certainty. to be able to plan and to be able to look forward. And that's why also Australia has taken a net zero commitment by 2050, and we lean in terms of global efforts to achieve net zero in order to provide that certainty and to provide the ability for long-term planning, long-term investment, long-term commitments from industry and other players. We also lean in the multilateral context. We chair at the moment in the IEA, the Critical Minerals Working Party. That forms for Australia a core part of how we engage globally to strengthen critical minerals security and to support diversification. We're also a member of the Minerals Security Partnership, which is a collaboration of 15 countries as well as the EU to catalyse public and private investment in responsible critical mineral supply chains, and also looking to advance projects that contribute to responsible critical mineral supply chains, demonstrating high ESG standards and facilitating the global energy transition. So I think, Justine, in response to your question, I think it's looking at the domestic, looking at the bilateral, looking at the plurilateral, and leaning into those partnerships that exist that can help us to build the frameworks to work together to drive investment and provide certainty for business.
Excellent. Look, thank you, Gaia. So I think that rounds out the perspective from the government's point of view. And I'd like to now introduce John Lindberg, who's Senior Manager of Policy and Government Affairs at the International Council on Mining and Metals. So welcome, John. The ICM is a peak body for the mining industry working on transparency and industry principles. So what can be done to boost market transparency and standard-based markets for critical minerals? And what is ICAM's advice on materials stewardship in the minerals and metals value chain?
Thank you, Justine, and it's great to be here. And I normally like to start off with a fairly startling fact, but one that I think we need to level set on. Doing things responsibly in the mining sector is still not the global norm. We still, despite decades of effort, have a long way to go. So ICMM, we represent about 1/3 of the global mining industry. As a condition of membership, our members have to adhere to the mining principles, which was one of the first standards created in this space. So we don't just talk the talk around responsible practices, we also walk the walk. And transparency and traceability are absolute cornerstones towards making responsible practices normative. Because if we can't prove that the minerals and metals that are being produced are actually produced in a responsible fashion, then those claims are worth absolutely nothing. A lot of efforts over the last couple of decades have been spent on building performance standards, essentially creating a common set of languages around, what and expectations around what does responsible practices actually look like. And we're getting there. It's resulted also in a landscape that has been very complex, with some mining companies applying 10 to 15 standards for a single site. Trying to get at the same problem, and we spend a lot of money just showing compliance against standards rather than raising performance. We're starting to see consolidation in that space, which is a very, very positive step. But what we're also starting to see, and rightfully so, is that society's expectations, and that's civil society, investors, governments, we need to actually be able to prove the rhetoric around responsible practices. We're starting to see increased demands for traceability. And this is something that ICMM and our members are working very hard on. But what we're starting to see, and I think if there's one recommendation that I especially want our government colleagues to heed, is that let's learn from the mistakes that we did in the responsible mining standards landscape. Let's not create 200 different standards and then try to figure out which one's the best. Let's come together, industry, governments, investors, civil society, affected communities, and co-create what actually traceability standards, what they should look like, create a global language, and from our perspective, the UN Transparency Protocol is a very good way of doing that, but also understanding that the reality on the ground for us is that let's use the still there. Let's use the standards that do exist, but let's simplify the landscape and make sure that we all speak a common language, because that is going to be really important, because 2/3 of the industry still don't use standards. So if we don't have a single language, it's very easy for them to say, well, this is too complicated, not going to engage with it. So that's a very important starting point. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, lots of important points in there, I think. So it's not just a question of diversifying supply chains. It's also a question of industry standards in the sense of ensuring that they actually exist, that they're applied, and that we don't end up with multiple standards that create a lot of burden for business in terms of fragmentation of requirements. Excellent. Thank you, John. So I'd like to now turn to Nafi Kwashi, who's Africa Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. So NRGI promotes a people-centered approach to natural resource management and development, looking at Indigenous and community perspectives. So I understand that NGRI has just put out new analysis on regionalizing African mineral value chains. So we'd like to hear what you consider the factors for success to be, and from an African perspective, how we might change the picture and contribute to a more diversified supply chains or diversified supply chains across the globe.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you very much for the invitation. But as you highlighted, and we have heard, and you highlighted, and we've heard from the different speakers, there is a structural imbalance. A structural imbalance that must be corrected urgently, not only for Africans, it's everyone's interest. Given the resilient supply chain requires people in producer countries also benefit. And the analysis we've seen, including those from IEA, showed that how some African value chain can be cheaper and greener than other regions, such as in Europe. So producing in Africa can be cheaper, but there is a lot to do for us to get there. And I'll try to summarize some of the success factors that we highlighted in our report. And it's a lot to unpack, but I'll try to do it in 2 minutes. So first, one of the findings is that Africa must negotiate collectively, all right? So not as 54 fragmented markets. We need to come together with African mineral underpinning the World Net Zero goals, coordinating and bargaining through AFTA. And our regional blocks and joint industrial platform would increase our leverage than having one single, African country negotiating. Second, one of the things that we also identified is that cooperation also needs to start small and targeted instead of, having it all over. While frameworks like the AFTA are vital enablers, regional progress is more likely through bottom-up coalitions of willing governments around specific opportunities. So, for example, the DRC-Zambia cooperation on battery precursors is a promising pilot for shared processing anchored in their complementary strengths, so in copper or cobalt. So third is benefit needs to be shared fairly between cooperating countries. So mechanisms like the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, proposed Green Mineral Value Chain Fund, could channel resources to less developed countries and incentivize sharing government revenue, jobs, supplier opportunities in shared facility. And fourth, we also recognize that we recommended that Africa needs fair global financing and technology partnership. And today, as we've also heard in most of the analysis, less than 5% of global energy transition investment flows to the continent. And without concessional capital, including to support mechanisms like the Africa Green Mineral Strategy Value Chain Fund, and without technology transfer, we cannot build competitive midstream capacity. So there has to be that support. And finally, governments must be treated as co-architects. So the African government must be treated as co-architects of global supply chains. So that means that transparent off-taker agreements, equitable trade terms, and value addition commitments that keep jobs, more jobs, revenues, and knowledge on the continent. So these were some of the recommendations that, and if we are able to align this, I'm sure that we can move the continent from capturing just 1% clean tech value to becoming a diversified, resilient, people-centered power, continent that can also contribute to the transition. And thank you very much.
Yeah, look, thank you very much. And your remarks prompted me to put back up this slide, which I think just shows really clearly the challenge, but also the opportunity for the African continent in setting out, as you go up the value chain, where we're at the moment. But I think that's the opportunity gap that we can aim to fill with some of the recommendations that you highlighted just now. So our final panelist, a warm welcome for Angela Asuncion, who's Senior Advisor on Transitional Minerals and Just Energy Transitions at the Resource Justice Network of the Asia Pacific Transition Mineral Accountability Working Group. Right, I hope I got that right. So Angela, in your role, you played a pivotal role in advancing regional cooperation, including through the development of the Asia Pacific Regional Advocacy Plan, championing people and planet-centered climate justice in the just energy transition. So can you share with us, from your regional perspective, what are the tools that government and industry can use to increase market transparency, and any other insights you want to share from your work?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Justine, and to the International Energy Agency panel for inviting us to speak today. I'm honored to represent the Resource Justice Network, the world's largest civil society network working towards equitable resource governance for a just energy transition. And so in terms of market transparency tools, there are many, and they could be identified under global standards such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which in 2023 they had disclosed energy transition mandates, which mandates countries to disclose their country policies, emissions reporting, and energy transition pathways and roadmaps. We can also see them in due diligence guidelines, for example, in OECD due diligence, Chinese mining due diligence guidelines, and within the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA guidelines. These create clear expectations for responsible business conduct, for example, under labor standards, emissions reporting, environmental monitoring. And lastly, we can also see them within beneficial ownership registries and transparency disclosures. And these are fundamental and critical to ensuring and combating corruption, which is rampant within the extractive industries. But with this being said, I want to emphasize the fundamental necessity that market transparency alone as a tool is not enough to address the historic harm within mining operations. We need to create an enabling environment with two specific conditions that will enable true justice in the energy transition in parallel with the strengthening of market transparency tools. The first is a strong civic space. So we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples, local community members, civil society, unions have their fundamental rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression upheld, so that they're able to analyze these disclosures and demand accountability without any reparations. And the second enabling condition would be strong binding accountability. And so like you mentioned, we need to ensure that there is a global binding mineral traceability agreement, one that ensures that human and environmental rights due diligence is upheld throughout the entire green energy and technology supply chain. And this cannot be done without strong political will and effective implementation of the rule of law. And so that's why today, over 100 civil society organizations across Asia Pacific and beyond have launched a joint statement calling on governments at COP30 to put transition minerals and human rights at the center of climate action and to explicitly include this text within COP30 negotiations. And so those are the overarching framework and parallel actions that need to be taken to ensure strengthened market transparency tools. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you, and I just wanted to pick up on your last point, because I know that in the Brazil's been really active, as we all know, on the action agenda, and as part of that, Paolo mentioned the mineral recycling rates that have been included in the proposed acceleration plan under the action agenda. But they also have a lot of work, and Pedro, you might want to comment on this, but Brazil's been very active as well in the just transition space. So I'm not sure that the two have actually been connected for now. I don't want to put you on the spot, but perhaps when you come back later on, Pedro might speak a little bit on that. Oh, sorry, you can't hear me. Sorry. Okay. Is that a bit better or not? I think it's just me. I need to scream. I was just making the point that under Brazil's action agenda, they pick up the issue of critical minerals, but more from a recycling point of view. And I was saying to Pedro that I know Brazil's been very active as well on just transition, but I'm not clear to what extent these two issues have actually been linked for now in the action agenda. So maybe that's something Brazil and others can try to pick up. So I wanted now to pose a question to all panelists, and I think everyone can hop in as they want to. We've got two sort of questions for the general rounds. So the first one is about innovation. So we've spoken a lot already about the question of diversification, but innovation can also be a complementary action in this area. And I wanted to ask our panel how innovation, including new extraction and processing technologies, help countries reduce dependencies and enhance the sustainability of critical mineral supply chains. And also, what innovation might be needed for improved traceability systems. So, please, anyone who wants to jump in, please do.
I can start. So if I understand correctly, Justine, it's about how innovation can be applied to the mining sector to help drive this agenda.
Yeah, and also as a complement for diversification efforts, because
Super.
Innovation can also provide...
So whenever I kind of hear these words, innovation and technology and such, I always want to have a bit of a definition, because we throw these terms around and I think sometimes we interpret them in different ways. So somebody that I respect very well gave a really good explanation to me once. He told me science and technology and R&D is effectively the transformation of money into knowledge. To transform that knowledge back into hopefully more money, that's innovation, that's commercialization, that's the scaling up. And that second piece is where I think the difficulty often lies, because governments, universities, research institutes will fund basic and applied research. University bookshelves are full of good ideas. How do you take those good ideas to solve a lot of the problems that are inherent to the mining sector in particular? And how do you take those good ideas and make them commercially viable? Because in the model that we have with the private sector and a market-based economy, you can't force companies, you can't force shareholders to take a loss. I mean, you can to a point. Governments do this through regulation, but not at an aggregate level. So I think one of the tricks is to be able to find innovation, create the market conditions to allow innovation to be applied. And those market conditions come with a sort of supply-demand equation, as I put it. There needs to be some government regulation to make sure that people are able to respect basic standards and controls. And at the same time, that there's enough of a profit there, not crazy windfall profits, but enough of a profit there that the industry will take it up and not feel that they're forced to have it. Because we've also seen on the general climate change agenda, when governments become too forward-leaning, in the extractive sector in particular, there can be a reaction, and not just from the companies, but from society as a whole. I think it's important to structure things that define the benefits economically and also socially to the kind of innovation we need to bring forward. Thanks, Justine.
Thanks. I wanted to echo, first of all, the ambassador said, and to build a bit on that. And I think one thing that we hear very often in the critical minerals conversation is diversification and innovation. And both of them are really important. But we also need to keep in mind, so one of the most significant bottlenecks in the critical minerals conversation, and we saw it very clearly, and see it behind me very clearly, is in what we know as the midstream, so the processing, the refining, the smelting segment of the critical minerals value chains is an extremely challenging segment. And that is something that we see, for instance, very clearly in the copper value chain right now. At the moment, it is loss-making to go into the midstream segment of the copper value chain. So companies that operate there lose money. They have to pay companies to essentially give them material so they have something to do, which is if we're going to continue with the market-based system, we need to really reconcile with the fact that the midstream is and going to continue to be very, very challenging. Companies that sit and own that space are very, very, very stressed financially. So expecting a lot of R&D and innovation to happen there is perhaps not the most reasonable ask. And this is where, universities play an important role. But I also think, in the conversation around diversification, what we're thinking primarily, I think, when we talk about diversification is building batteries, is building wind turbines, is building solar PVs. But you have to get through, if you like, the valley of death that is the midstream, and that's really challenging. And innovation there, I don't think you can expect too much from the private sector when the current market situation is what it is today.
So it's about trying to think about this question of innovation and creating incentives at various and different parts of the value chain and what that looks like. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me back there? Yep. Okay. Excellent. I just thought I'd jump in with an example. So we in Australia have tried to grapple with this question around innovation, and we've set up a Australian critical minerals R&D hub that is run by CSIRO, our science research organisation. So it's had an initial $50 million put into it, $50.5 million. Not a lot, but enough, hopefully. And it's set up around 4 objectives, which I think go beyond that kind of core initial R&D to look at the commercialization and scaling up in an attempt to work along the kind of the production stream. So the 4 objectives are scaling up and commercializing critical minerals research and development, coordinating, guiding and prioritizing critical minerals research, development and expertise across Australia. But there's also an international connection point as well as part of the kind of pillars underneath the hub. Connecting critical minerals projects to technical and research experts and supporting international critical minerals collaboration. So attempting kind of to bring these pieces together into a hub, which I think is why we've called it a hub rather than a research centre or or anything else. So that's an attempt that we're making. Unfortunately, I don't have any sort of outcomes here yet because I think it's still early days, but one to watch perhaps.
Excellent. Yeah. So when was that established, Gaia?
It was 2 years ago. Yeah.
Pedro, please.
Yes. No, I think for this discussion, it's very important to highlight the relevance of international cooperation in this domain, right? Either for innovation, assuring that we are able to have real internationally developed technologies that are suitable for different sets of countries and realities, but also having more difficult discussions on mining, as we might have been able to do with energy issues across the last 50 years. I think mining there are several international dialogues that happen, but not at the same level as it is required for the major effort that we are all engaged in, which was the previous slide on the exponential growth that we need to see in the coming years. And you mentioned, Justine, the action agenda, and I think that from Brazil, this discussion is very relevant inside the just transitions debate, but also in the action agenda, because mining is not a new issue, right? Mining has been here for centuries. But to do it in a sustainable and inclusive way, and along the way promoting international cooperation, we will need to discuss it thoroughly in every international fora. And we think that we can do it in the action agenda. Is the prime place for us to have that discussions.
And of course, the action agenda has a tail to it, because actions are intended to be undertaken over the next to 2028, so in the period of the next global stocktake. So what we've seen the last few months is the start of the action agenda, and there'll be further efforts after that. Angela, please come in.
Thank you, Justine. Yes, circularity and recycling are key to global action. And I want to echo the IEA's report findings that highlight a major gap in recycling between underdeveloped and developed economies. For e-waste collection rates in developing economies in Asia, they're below 5%, whereas in North America, you can see them from 40 to 50%. And so we need government support to strengthen recycling infrastructure and technology transfer in underdeveloped economies. However, from an Asia-Pacific and Global South perspective, we need transformative innovation that moves beyond technology towards socio-political innovation that addresses the systemic human and environmental rights violence and issues throughout the entire green technology supply chain. And the Asia-Pacific is at the heart of the energy transition. We're host to 1/4 of the world's mineral reserves. We produce 50% of the world's nickel, and we are host to 60% of the world's rare earth metals. And so when we talk about the sustainability and traceability of critical mineral supply chains, it's important that we're grounded in the realities of what sustainability and justice mean in the energy transition. And so I wanted to share with everyone and remind us that this week, the Philippines has been ravaged with its 21st typhoon, despite contributing 0.35% to global greenhouse gas emissions. We are the world's second largest nickel producing nation and the world's most climate vulnerable country globally. And so we bear the dual impacts of extractive violence that's being intensified under the energy transition, and also the intensification and the exacerbation of climate inequity. And so while mining is being intensified, it's also removing critical carbon sinks and critical climate mitigating ecosystems that are necessary for climate action and community protection. And it's also important to understand at the international level the systemic issues of overconsumption between global north and global south countries. For example, wealthy countries use 6 times more natural resources per capita than low-income countries. And the richest 1% of the world's population emits as much as 2/3 of the world's poorest. Most of the demand for transition minerals are for private electric vehicle usage rather than for public renewable energy access. And about 65 to 70% of global nickel production is used in stainless steel, which accounts for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions and is one of the hardest industries to decarbonize. And then lastly, while positioned as indispensable for renewable technologies, mineral demand has also been absorbed into expanding defense technology. Militaries are responsible for 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and rising defense expenditures under ongoing genocides and political rivalries risk diverting scarce mineral resources away from renewable technology. And so when we talk about transformative innovation for sustainable transition minerals, we also talk about the common but differentiated responsibilities approach under the UNFCCC that calls on global north countries to reduce consumption and address systemic efficiency approaches in terms of public transportation and electrified transportation systems, as well as establishing a binding mineral traceability agreement, as mentioned before. Thanks so much.
Angela, I'm conscious of the time. We still have about 5 minutes left. And Angela's neatly taken us into the final question that I wanted to put to our panelists. And welcome reflections from any or all of you, but keep them please short so we can finish up in time. But Angela mentioned before the notion of a strong civic space, and I really like that concept. I think it really captures really well what we're trying to do. And I wanted to ask our panelists what you consider the most effective strategies to ensure communities in resource-rich regions benefit equitably from mineral extraction and processing. So what are some of the ways that we can make mining more inclusive?
Thank you very much. You know, the continent, Africa sits at the heart of the global transition. And yet the communities who live on top of where these minerals are remain very far from its benefits. And so our work from Africa, Asia, Latin America shows one clear truth, that without people-centered governance, this transition will continue to produce the same extractive inequalities that we've seen in the past. And so we need to change that. And if we want resilient, responsible supply chain, we must if we want resilient and responsible supply chain, we must embed equity, into the rules through binding community agreements, transparent licensing, indigenous rights, and real local value creation. And the transition cannot be just if people who carried its impacts do not also carry its rewards. Secondly, ensuring equitable community benefits. So equity doesn't happen by accident. It occurs when benefits are legally guaranteed. So these must be in the legal document. And we shouldn't just leave them to CSIRs. And the most effective strategy is to hardwire fairness into the system. Transparent licensing, equitable revenue sharing, enforceable community development agreement, and real local content tied to skill and value addition. And when communities have data, voice, and oversight power, the wealth in the ground can translate to livelihood above the ground. And I'd like to add one last thing, which is about integrating priorities. Integrating indigenous knowledge and priorities. We need to stop treating indigenous people as stakeholders and start treating and recognizing them as right holders and co-designers of energy transition. That means operationalizing the FPIC, integrating indigenous knowledge into impact assessment and monitoring, resourcing their institutions and aligning supply chain decisions with their economic and cultural priorities and realities. If indigenous wisdom doesn't shape the upstream stage, sustainability definitely will not hold in the downstream because there will be a lot of chaos. And so those are some of the things that I would like to add to this.
Nafi, thank you so much. And I like this notion of hardwiring and fairness too to the process. Gaia, please.
Let's see if I can make this work. So we've thought about this too in the Australian context, and there are a couple of things that I wanted to offer. So we look at community benefit principles in terms of Australian government investment in priority sectors such as critical minerals, and we focus on investing in local communities, supply chains and skills, as well as promoting diverse workforces and secure jobs. We also work with First Nations peoples to manage the climate crisis and strengthen action. And an example of that is our First Nations Clean Energy Strategy that was built in partnership with Indigenous businesses and communities to support Indigenous-led energy projects and capacity building. And actually, I can tell you the two people who wrote that strategy are friends of mine. They're both very proud First Nations Australians. So I know that they took a very inclusive approach when they were doing that. Our critical minerals strategy also outlines the benefit of including genuine engagement and collaboration with First Nations communities, and consideration of First Nations benefit has been embedded into programs such as the Critical Minerals Development Program and International Partnership on Critical Minerals, which require applicants to attach to program applications a strategy that would support First Nations recruitment, procurement and engagement plans. So from an Australian perspective, we see that building these things in, it doesn't detract from the growth of the sector. Instead, it creates a positive point of difference that gives Australian producers a competitive edge, as well as having the community and First Nations benefits that we need in terms of responsible governance. So nice to wrap up that way as we sit underneath this beautiful Indigenous artwork here.
I'll be really quick. I echo everything that you've just said, because at the core or at the heart of responsible mining is making sure that everyone that is part of the ecosystem gets a fair deal. And to achieve that, I think there's three sort of key components to that. It's transparency, be it contract transparency, be it transparency around how governments spend the revenue from the mining companies. So transparency all across, super important, first one. Second one, strong governance, but also strong enforcement of that governance. Governments need to not only recognize their role, governments need to do their role. Private industry shouldn't be policing themselves. Governments should do that. Second. Third, strong standards. We know that standards can play a hugely transformative role in raising the bar and making sure that local communities and affected communities get a really good deal. But if we don't make adherence to strong standards, especially in jurisdictions where governance might not exist, or might be weaker, or might not be enforced, then standards plays a pivotal role in ensuring that the benefits from the mine is distributed in a fair fashion. Thank you.
Excellent. Now I'm conscious we are 2 minutes over time, so I would just invite you all to thank our panelists very much for the excellent discussion we've had today. A big thank you from the IEA as well. I'm very, very grateful for your time in coming today.